The Prophet ﷺ said, "None of you will have faith until he wishes for his brother what he wishes for himself." I wish for a meal for iftar.
I wish for a drink to end my fast.
I wish for a joyous Eid. For some, wishes are simple needs that we can fulfill. This Ramadan, join AMA in fulfilling the wishes of families in need across the world.
Apparently there's a car outside, CXCMP, your windows are open. Your windows are open. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وأصحابه وبارك وسلم. Amma ba'd, to all the people present in the masjid, both downstairs and the ladies upstairs, our listeners on Radio 786 and the viewers on YouTube and Facebook, we greet you from Masjidul Quds. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I think I would not be making an understatement if I said that today, unfortunately, in the country, every one of us, it appears as if we are in a dark hole. We don't know which way things are moving. And among the main topics around your breakfast, lunch, and supper table is the topic of the future of the country, not only for people of my age and Judge's age, but even our young people, our children, and our grandchildren. It's actually a very worrisome situation that we are facing. And the masjid normally has a program of seminars during the month of Ramadan. Alhamdulillah, we had one last week on inheritance. It was very, very well received by the people that were here and those who watched afterwards. And today we felt we will have a seminar on this very important topic of South Africa, your future, what future? It's our country, and I would like to believe that the Muslim community has contributed immensely to the development of this country, and it is therefore our right to know which way things are heading for. And we have a wonderful panel. First of all, I'd like to welcome on behalf of every Cape Townian who's coming to the masjid for the first time, Bashir Adam, if you can, Bashir with a white shirt. And then another personality that's been here before, he's delivered a Jummah talk, or I think more than one Jummah talk, political analyst Ibrahim Fakir, looks handsomer by the day. And then the Honorable Retired Judge Siraj Desai, who really needs no introduction to the people of Cape Town and the rest of the country. So having done that, I would now like to call upon our Imam, Sheikh Abdul Rahman Alexander, who will open the proceedings with a short dua and some opening comments as well. Sheikh Abdul Rahman Alexander.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم افتح لنا بالخير واختم لنا بالخير واجعل عواقب أمورنا بالخير بيدك الخير والعافية إنك على كل شيء قدير. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وسلام على المرسلين Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Our Honorable MC, Haji Sattar Parker, our distinguished guest, my dear brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, and all our respected viewers on Facebook and YouTube, and our respected listeners on Radio 786, I greet you all with the universal greetings of love, peace, and mercy. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, it gives me great pleasure on behalf of the Imamat of Masjidul Quds, the Board of Trust and the Executive, to extend a very hearty welcome to each and everyone, first and foremost, to our very formidable team of panelists that we have in front, as well as to each and everyone present. And I'm sure the question which is topmost in the minds of many, many South Africans with regard to the political situation, the future of South Africa, your future, what future, inshallah, will be properly addressed and promptly addressed and very adequately by our team of panelists here. And I hope their presentations, and I trust it will be empowering and enriching to each and everyone. Amen. So without further ado, Mr. MC, Bismillah.
Shukran very much, Sheikh Abdul Rahman, those few wise words. So we commence with our first speaker today. He is a leading chartered accountant in South Africa, the CEO of one of the largest chartered accountancy companies in our country, Next SAB&T. Spent a large part of his life in the auditing and accounting profession, serves on the international board of Next, which is one of the world's largest network of chartered accountants. He's a very keen student of economics and figures and how it affects people. And he has a passion to dissect economic information, particularly for the common person. I had the privilege of watching him and listening to him for the first time 2 weeks ago, when he gave an absolutely brilliant overview of the budget that was revealed in Parliament a few weeks ago, and his ability to be able to put it across in an absolutely no-nonsense way so that it makes a lot of sense to the common people. Before I call upon him, the topic that we have asked him to speak on is South Africa today, the economic outlook and the future landscape. In my opinion, there are 6 things which people need in this world. Then you don't care who governs you. The one is your freedom. The second one is security. The third one is employment. The fourth one is education. The fifth one is a roof above your head. And the last one is your health and your well-being. And all this is all linked to the economy of the country. Therefore, to speak to us on this topic, South Africa today, the economic outlook and the future landscape, gives me immense pleasure to call upon Bashir Adam.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So Darba, I listened to you and I asked myself, do I really deserve the accolades? And I don't think so. But I think the one thing that we all faced with is what is currently happening in South Africa. Now, to put that into context, in 1994, probably a month after I started practice, I had an opportunity to move to the States. Los Angeles, for those of you that are big, bold and beautiful fans, the firm was in Wilshire Boulevard and everything that was nice about it. And after thinking about it for about 2 hours, I said, no. We've got a role to play in South Africa. We're going to make a difference. We just found our freedom. That's what we're going to do, and that's where I'm going to stay. 29 years later, I asked myself, was that the right decision that I made way back when? However, when we think about where we are, where the country is, I think to myself, Western Cape, well, you guys are not that bad. I mean, I was here 2 weeks ago, I got here yesterday. I'm still looking for my first pothole. I haven't found a pothole in Cape Town yet, so it's not as bad as everywhere else. But for us to talk about the economic outlook of the country, I think one needs to take account of everything else that has been said and has been contextualized over the course of the last few weeks. Now, if we think about it, where does our year start? The first week of February, the president comes out and he talks about SONA. A few weeks after that, by and large, the financial or the Minister of Finance comes out and he talks about the budget speech and he lays what we've achieved or what we haven't achieved. And sometimes they make what we haven't achieved look like what we have achieved, right? So that's a bit of the spin doctoring and all of those things that come through. But we come through with all of those things, and by and large, when we look at it, we say, well, it doesn't look too bad. Now, the question is not so much what is being said to you, but what's not being said. What's between the lines? What is the stuff that the person, the layman, not the economist, not the accountant, not the judge, not the political analyst, the layman doesn't get to see in the budget. In other words, it's not in black and white, but if you analyze it and you go in between, that's where all of those things are. So as a start and as the basis for today's discussion, we're going to talk about this year's budget, the context of this budget, what this budget means going forward, and what the implications was of where this budget was this year. Now, if we think the Honorable Minister of Finance came out and the first thing he said was the economic outlook of the country was that we achieved a 2.5% growth rate this year. That was the first thing. We achieved a 2.5% growth rate this year. And everyone says, yeah, because we didn't expect to achieve a 2.5% growth rate a year ago. So that's a great thing. And we've achieved something fantastic about it. But in the very next sentence, he says, we achieved a growth rate of 2.5 and we expect to achieve 1.4% growth over the next 3 years. Now you look at that in the big context of things, it's not all that bad. There's growth. Russia's in recession. We know why they're in recession. They're at war with Ukraine. The UK is in recession because they don't know if they want to be in the European Union or they don't want to be in the European Union. That's where the UK is. America, for some or other reason, is just full steam ahead. That economy just keeps going and going and going, despite what everyone thinks, and that fuels inflation. And we now see China coming out of its slumber. And what's that going to mean in terms of where we are? So when we look at the 2.1 or the 2.5% coupled with the 1.4% going forward, we say that's not all too bad. But where do we go from there? The next sentence that he says is the economic outlook faces a range of risks. Now, you just told us how great we've done. Now you're preparing us. You're already preparing us for what we're not going to do. So you're telling us this is what's going to happen, right? Provided that and that doesn't happen. Why do we say those things as politicians? Because next year when we don't achieve 1.4%, what do we say? But we told you last year there was a risk of A, B, C, and D, right? So all of those things are what's there. Now, what were those risks, if we think about it? Further disruptions to global supply with the war in Ukraine and Russia. Guess what? That war is not going to end in the next year. It's not going to end in the next few weeks. So that risk will come real. That risk will become a reality. Continued power cuts. Anyone guess, are we going to stop getting power cuts anytime in the next year? No. So continued power cuts is going to impact the growth of South Africa. Deterioration in the ports and rail infrastructure. I was reading the other day, after how long did the one rail, the main line start again in Cape Town? After 5 years? 3 years? After 3 years. So everything, including our public transport, is falling down. It's taking us years to get things back up. I looked at a graph this morning that said the Transnet output in terms of tonnage that is sent out over the course of the last 5 years has fallen by 50%, right, in terms of what we're sending out. So those are the kind of things that poses a risk to us. Then the next one, I mean, come on, think about it. The minister says, widespread criminal activity. I'm not an economist, and I'm certainly not a minister, and I'm certainly not a politician, but logic tells me that if we've got widespread criminal activity and corruption, that there will be an issue in growth, right? So those are the other things that's there. And then it says, government is taking urgent measures to address all of these things. Okay, there's a shining light. Government is taking urgent measures to address all of these things. But I went and I sat back a little bit and I said, okay, let's just think about all the things that the minister says and how this then impacts us going forward. And what it came down to was, I looked at the context and I said, okay, so how did we achieve 2.5% growth? How did we actually get to 2.5% growth? One, SARS was extra efficient, to the point that they were aggressive. Right? So SARS and what they refer to as enhanced tax administration. So here's a tip for you businessmen out there. The first tip for the afternoon. Part of SARS being enhancing their tax administration is digging out the dormant company that you had lying dormant for the last 15 years and not submitting tax returns and charging you administration penalties for not submitting tax returns for the last 15 years. So that's how SARS is becoming more efficient. They're finding the stuff that we're not doing because no one asked for it for the last 15 years. Why should we have done it? Now they're saying, but you should have done it because that's what the Tax Administration Act says. So they say one thing, they practice one thing, and then when it suits them, they implement something else, right? Same thing with provisional taxpayers. They changed the definition, never implemented it, and this year started penalizing everybody for not submitting their returns on time. So that was the first thing. SARS was great in terms of what they did. But if we look into all of this, we've got rising debt in the country. So the amount of debt in the country has grown by 100%. We've doubled the amount of debt in the country since 2018. Now, if we put that into context, with debt, higher debt comes higher cost of borrowing. What comes with higher cost of borrowing, or currently, we spend in South Africa 1 billion rand a day on interest that you and I pay. So 20% of every rand that we pay in tax goes to service the debt of the country. Now that's not my estimate, that's a fact. We pay 1 billion rand a day in interest. Right? I'm going to talk a little bit later about a fragile tax base. We've got a very fragile tax base. We've got a very narrow tax base, and I'll point out why I say we're a fragile tax base. The problem is, if that tax base cracks, we don't have the support to implement anything that needs to be supported. I've already touched on the Ukraine war. Infrastructure challenges. Our ports are standing still. Our rail is standing still. We all know what's happening with Eskom. So we don't have power. So that's just the way things are going to happen. And what do we happen in South Africa? When all of these things happen, we appoint a commission or a committee or a task team or something that puts a lot of people in the room to have lunch and talk a lot of long stories and write a thick report with no action at the end of the day. Right or wrong? That's what happens. That's where we put the efforts in instead of getting things done. But more than all of that, we've developed a culture in South Africa, one of non-payment. Right? So we've got a culture of non-payment. We've got a culture of lack of accountability. We have a culture of ill discipline because we don't enforce and we don't implement. And we have one of procrastination. Right? Why do today what can be done tomorrow or next year and in 2 years' time? So unfortunately, that's the reality of where we are. Now, if we look at that context against the backdrop of unemployment levels amongst youth hovering in excess of 50%, right? What does that make you think about? The Arab Spring. Think about it. The youth not being employed, the youth not being able to work, the youth not being able to put bread on the table. What happens? Right? It bubbles underneath until one day it explodes. Right? That's the Arab Spring. So I don't think we're too far away from the African Spring, but my learned colleagues in the political scenario can talk a little bit more about that. Other than SARS, that's the state-owned entity, or the one state-owned entity that's actually performing to the point that it's breaking its target market, it's breaking its records, it's breaking the taxpayers, it's enforcing at every level. But at some point you reach a level where the productive actions of SARS is actually unproductive to what comes in, because taxpayers just can't give anymore at some point. Right? And I'll put that into context just now. Our education system need an overhaul completely. We put that into context. 2 surveys recently, the Pearls and the TIM surveys, and South Africa ends last in numeracy and literacy. Something we need to think about. Why is it that we're ending last on all of these things? I've already mentioned state-owned enterprises, but Eskom's not the only one that's dead. The ports and Transnet and the Rail Freight Association are not the only ones that's dead. Praza is just about dead. The post office is dying a very slow death and a very painful death. Right? But the post office is, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt and dead. Water and sanitation. One of the things that came out in the budget, we've spoken about water and sanitation, what is going on there, and it's not going well. And that list goes on. I can stand here all day and we can pick every one and go through every one of them, but all of them have issues. And that, unfortunately, is the reality. Then the one that breaks the camel's back, crime. How do we deal with crime? All right? That's the one that we can't accept as people, because if you don't have security in the sanctity of your home, or in the masjids that we frequent, or in your place of work, then what do we have? If we don't have any of those things, then what do we have? And that is the one that puts the most risk on the country and the security of its people. Because if we're not safe in where we live and where we work, how can we be productive? Right? So these are the types of things that we need to think about. So some of the solutions, now, everyone's picked up the issues. All right? These were the issues. But government also said we had some solutions. National Treasury will encourage and improve the culture of non-payment. I think, just step back and think about National Treasury is going to drive the behavioral change of non-payment. That's not National Treasury's job. That's the job of government. That should be taken on by the president. The president should be walking that road. He should be implementing, putting in the necessary steps in place to make that happen. But National Treasury is not going to do it. Government will take on 254 billion. That is more than 50% of Eskom's debt. Now, this is interesting, right? Because when they take over 254 billion, and you're going to look at the projected debt over the next 3 years, what would you expect to happen? If government debts, assuming that it stands constant, and we add Eskom's debt to that, you'd assume that the debt would increase by 254 billion, correct? Because we're taking 254 billion of Eskom's debt. If you're going to look at the numbers they project, debt in the next 3 years will climb by 1 trillion rand. So we're taking on 254 billion in revenue, and our debt is climbing by 1 trillion. How does that make sense? So here's the answer. We are borrowing money, not to build infrastructure, etc., that can produce and stimulate and be productive in the economy. We are borrowing money to consume. That's what we're doing. Now, those of you in business, those of you with a business mind, we've always been taught long-term debt finances assets, short-term debt finances the short-term assets, right? The working capital. We are borrowing long-term debt to fund our spending on a daily basis. Now that's a big, big problem. But more importantly than that is that Eskom are only going to get the 254 billion bailout on two conditions. On two conditions. One is that they must concession out all their power stations. That's the first one. The second one is that, like everything else, we will appoint a consortium to advise them on what to do. So remember what I said about commission, state, task force, committee. Now we're appointing a consortium to tell them what to do. But the important one on that one is the fact that from an Eskom perspective, the fact that they must concession out their power stations to the private sector is a fundamental shift in policy from the ANC. Remember? Nationalization, we will never privatize state assets. That's the policy state. But what are we doing if we're saying you must concession out? We're privatizing the operations of Eskom. That's what we're doing. So, from a policy perspective, we can't say that there's a policy shift from nationalization to privatization, but now we can subtly go and start privatizing bits and pieces of state assets. That's exactly what's happening. Right. So if we look at all of that, that's Eskom and its state debt. We're going to encourage taxpayers to invest in energy generation through tax incentives. So we give you and I and our businesses tax incentives to put in solar panels, to renew the to put in renewable energy projects, and we'll get a tax deduction for all of those things. Then, from an electricity perspective, we will, that was the highlight of the President Sona's speech. we are going to appoint the Minister of Electricity. I said, okay, that's interesting. I mean, let's face it, it's an absolute gem. So now who controls ESCOM? The Minister of Public Enterprises, Praveen Gordhan, the Minister of Energy and Minerals and Energy, Gwede Mantashe, or the Minister of Electricity? Who controls it? Guess what? Who controls it? Nobody. Because when there's too many people and no one takes accountability, nothing happens. If nobody takes accountability, nothing happens. And that's exactly what's going to happen as we stand. Now, let's put that into context. Our Minister of Electricity came in, first thing he said was, I'm going to visit all the power stations and do an assessment. Second thing he says was, within a year or two, load shedding will be something of the past. Third thing he said was, we will never exceed stage 6 load shedding. 3 days ago he said, we should be preparing for stage 10 load shedding. Okay, so now when you listen to someone like that, it doesn't give you a whole lot of confidence, right? Because things just go up and down, and that's the way it works. So that's something we've got to worry about. We're going to take the diesel refund that we give people, we're going to help them in the food manufacturing stuff. We're going to put diesel refunds back into people to lessen the impact of fuel. And we're going to give money to address crime, right? So we're going to give money to the police to recruit 15,000 or 10,000 trainees. Now, you should shiver when you ask yourself, who's going to train those trainees? Because if it's the very competent force that we have at the moment, then those trainees should be really well trained by the time they come out on the other side, right? So that's the first thing we need to look at. The second thing we need to look at is we're going to give the NPA 100 million rand, 100 million rand, to prosecute all the people implicated, or some of the people implicated in the state capture, as what came out from Judge Zondo. Right? Now, we spent R1 billion or 2 billion rand on the Zondo Commission, taxpayers' money. 1 billion. Thank you, Judge. 1 billion rand we spent, but we're going to spend 100 million rand to prosecute the people on it. Now, doesn't make sense, right? That we're going to spend 100 million rand to actually do justice. But again, what does that say? That says we put something in, we hope to hit, and at some point we even expect an outcome, but we don't put in the proper resources. So that's the kind of stuff that we need to think about in terms of where we're going and what we're going to achieve. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at where we are in terms of growth, Sub-Saharan Africa is poised to grow at an average of 4% over the next 3 years. Right? The world is poised to grow at around 3% over the next 3 years. South Africa, according to National Treasury and their budget, says we're going to grow by 1.4% over the next 3 years. The Reserve Bank, who are much better at forecasting than what National Treasury is, has just revised the growth down to 0.2%. Right? So who do you believe? Anyone? Nobody. Right? Play neutral, stay safe, and say we're not going to experience growth for the next 3 years. Because what's happening? The Ukraine war is not going to end. Load shedding is not going to end. So all the risks that were pointed out is not going to end. So we shouldn't be surprised if we don't achieve anything in the next few years. From a debt perspective, in 2021, we were supposed to have bridged debt at 71% of GDP. We didn't do it. We now put the peak in 2025-26, that we're going to peak at 73% of GDP. Right? That's not going to happen either. But it does demonstrate the culture we have of procrastinating. We can't make a call and stick by it. And what happens as that goes up? The borrowing costs go up more than anything else. So brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, when you decide on the future in terms of where you are, let me leave two more facts with you to put into context just how fragile we are. In South Africa, corporate taxes contribute some 18% to revenue. That's company tax. A total of 770 companies, not 770,000, 770. Not 7,700, 770, as in 770. Pay 60% of all corporate tax. Now, what happens if those companies, or any amount of those companies, are taken over by foreigners, are closed down, don't meet demand, don't meet their profit targets, etc., etc.? Think about the impact on our tax revenue. What is more scary than that? Doesn't quite work that way, Judge. What is more scary than that is that from an individual perspective, the single biggest contributor to tax in South Africa, so we as individuals pay approximately 37% of all revenue comes from individuals. So let me give you a breakdown of that. South Africa has 14.5 million registered taxpayers, individuals, 14.5 million. 7.5 million of those don't pay tax because they're under the threshold, they earn less than the threshold, so they don't pay any tax. They're poor. Yeah, they're poor. That's what it comes down to. Right? So they don't pay tax, right? Then we have the top end, where 160,000 people pay tax at the maximum marginal rate. So 160,000 people earn above 1.5 million rand in South Africa, and they pay tax at the maximum marginal rate. Now that's 160,000 people, and the total tax that they contribute to the country is 30% of all personal income tax. 160,000 people. Not 1.6 million, 160,000 people. The scary part about those 160,000 people is those are also the 160,000 people that pay the most VAT in terms of the goods they purchase. Those are also the 160,000 people that pay the most fuel taxes because they're the people that own the cars and can fill up tanks, etc., etc., etc. But what would happen if we lost 10% or 15% or 20% of those 160,000 people? Because those 160,000 people are also the 160,000 people that are able to immigrate and migrate to other countries around the world because they've got the capital, the know-how, the assets, etc., etc., to be welcomed into other countries. How do we deal with that? Right? Those are the people that are not here. Now, Satarbai sent me an article yesterday about one of the real captains of industry, speaking about the potential and the hope and everything else in South Africa. And Satarbai, you'd have noticed that I did send you a message, but I deleted it afterwards. Right? Because while I agree with all of those captains of industry that say how great South Africa is and how much potential it is, and how they are committed to the long-term growth, etc., of South Africa, most of those captains of industry have all their wealth and their families and everything else outside of South Africa. That, unfortunately, is the harsh reality of it, irrespective of what it is that they say. Finally, the one thing, and I mentioned the advent of the African Spring, and I also mentioned the growth in debt over the next few years. One of the reasons feeding the growth in debt is that we started something during the pandemic that we can't reverse. And that's, we've increased the grants to the COVID-19 grant. So we've now got grants. We paid 27 million people receive grants in South Africa on a monthly basis. The reality is how is it possible to reverse a grant once you've given? My opinion is no, that it's not, without causing severe destruction and unhappiness with the people and the recipients of those grants. So that's something we need to think about. Government has recognized that we need to think about how we replace the grant. Don't replace the grant. If you're spending something, you're spending something. Call it whatever else you want to call it, you're still spending it. So we can't really do away with that grant. It becomes a permanent fixture in terms of where we are. Brothers and sisters, in conclusion, I think everything is not always as it seems. And sometimes we need to look a little bit deeper in terms of the decisions that we make in our lives. Have we hit the precipice from a South African perspective? In my opinion, yes, we have. Can we pull it back? Absolutely, because that's who we are. That's what we are. We're resilient. We do things. Siddhartha, you said something about the Muslim community. I think it is immeasurable how much we have contributed towards the South African economy. But it's the communities like us that are going to be needed to pull it back. Government is not going to do it. Jazakallah for listening.
Jazakallah to you, Bashir Adam. Ending off on a very positive note, but giving us the scenario of the economy, the way it is. And as we know, the economy is the engine driver of the country. There are a few questions that's come through, Bashir, but I'll leave the questions for a little later on. One of them is a very challenging question, but we'll pose that to you a little later on. Our next speaker, recipient of the Ruth First Scholarship at the University of Witwatersrand, worked at the IDASA offices both in Pretoria and Cape Town, author of many publications in some of the acclaimed journals of the world, much sought after political analyst, essentially for the independent opinion, visiting fellow at the University of Sussex in the UK, Draper Hill's Fellowship at the University of Stanford. His opinions on the political scenarios are sought after and respected by business people nationally and internationally. To speak to us today on the topic, a sketch of the short and medium-term political outlook with emphasis on the hopes and aspirations of the people. Gives me great pleasure to call upon a good friend of mine, Ibrahim Fakir.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm waiting for the speaker to come from somewhere at the back, because that certainly wasn't me. Satar Bhai, Jazakallah, shukran for that very kind introduction. Trustees of the masjid, respected Imam, Assalamu alaikum. Shukran for having me again. You did note, Satar Bhai, that I dressed up. If you don't have the substance, then you must have the style. And so I think Bashir has already laid out all of the substance. And I think what is clear from what Brother Bashir is saying is that we have a crisis of government. We don't necessarily have a crisis of politics, and we don't have a crisis of democracy. We certainly don't have a crisis of democracy. But we do have a crisis of government. Now, the problem, though, is even though I say that we may not have a crisis of politics, the reality is that government is a byproduct of politics. So if you had, and if you have, bad politics, you inevitably will end up having bad government. So people might say, on the face of it, on the surface of it, our politics are not that rotten, they're not that bad. Well, actually there are. Because if they weren't, we wouldn't have the kind of problems that we do in government, and we do have fairly significant problems in government. But be that as it may, I want to focus on 4 F's, and I promise you none of the F's are a swear word. So the first is I want to look at the question of the future. I want to look at the question of fear. And I think if Bashir hasn't instilled the fear in you, then I don't know, you are made of much more steely stuff. So I want to focus a little bit on the question of fear and the future. But most importantly, I want to focus on the root Arabic word fikr, which is the root word for the word furqan. That means the ability to decide what is right and what is wrong. So why do we need to worry about the future? We need to worry about the future for two reasons. The first is that our crisis of government is a crisis which is stemming from the problem of predatory politics. So we don't have patronage politics, which is the kind of politics which happens everywhere around the world. You get into office in order to dispense patronage. You dispense patronage to certain constituencies and certain communities in society. That can sometimes be counterproductive, and it is. But our problem in South Africa is we don't have patronage politics. It would be better if we had patronage politics. We don't. What we in fact have is predatory politics. So people who get into government and use the political process in order to access public office, and you access public office in order to be a predator. And you know what predators do, so I don't need to tell you. That's the first reason why we need to be why we need to worry about the future. The second is that we are a community which is obviously rooted in the society. We are a part of the society, and many of us don't have options to look anywhere else. This is the only society that you know, and the option of looking elsewhere, Bashir, as you say, there may be captains of industry and others who do so, and that's good for them, but they often speak with forked tongue. They speak with both sides, or from both sides of their mouths. And that's because they don't face the reality of the problems that ordinary South Africans do. And I think many of us, alhamdulillah, are better off than many of our fellow South Africans. But there are many people in the Muslim community who face fairly significant problems because of the government failure and the failures that Bashir was talking about, because they are entirely reliant on those public services. And so if they are unable to access those public services at the level of scale and quality and depth that is required, the only other place they can procure it is on the private market, but they can't afford it. And so if they can't afford it, the only place that's left is that the solidarity organizations have to start providing this. So towards the end, I will talk about what I think the community has to do in order to address some of these problems. But let's look at this question of what the political future is, because I was asked to talk about certain scenarios that might unfold. Now, many people talk about the fact that South Africa might be going through a second transition, that there is a move away from the dominant majority that the ANC has enjoyed. Of course, you in the Western Cape, in the city of Cape Town in particular, don't experience that because you seem to have a different government. But be assured that you live in a province and a city governed by a different party doesn't make you immune from what happens in the rest of the society and the rest of the country. Of course, you may be better off in some respects, but you can be rest assured that what happens nationally will affect both the city and the province. Now, nevertheless, let's look at what the potential futures might look like. The first, as I say, people say that there may be a second transition afoot, and that is that the dominance of the ANC may be broken come the next election. I'm not entirely certain about that, because if you look at the cumulative and compounded decrease in the ANC's performance election upon election from 1999, it is decreased by about 4.5%. Now, the fact that there is a greater deficit in trust and confidence in the ANC means that that average might shoot up a little higher come the next election. So they may settle close to 51% or 50%, which is just over the majority that they will require to be able to form a government on their own. That's the first. The second is that there may potentially be a new electoral system come the next election, where independent candidates would be allowed to contest against political parties. Now, there are serious problems with this potential new electoral system, and there may be more thoroughgoing electoral reform in the future, and that potential is real. But the reality is that in the next election, even if the ANC dips just below 50%, they might be able to make up the numbers by calling upon certain independents or micro small parties that may be out in the political landscape. And these micro small parties will be too happy to partner with the ANC, as you have seen happen in the city of Joburg. And what that does is that it erodes the level of trust and credibility that voters have, not just in those small micro parties, but in the bigger parties as well. So this crisis that I'm talking about, this crisis of government that Bashir was outlining, stems from the crisis of politics. And why is this crisis of politics the way it is? Well, firstly, because political parties are abusing the trust of their voters, as I've just shown you. First. Second, because the parties are unstable and because the parties have internal problems, they take those problems into institutions of government. And so what affects the political party starts to affect what's happening in government. And so when you have these small micro parties coming together with other major parties to give them a majority, it starts introducing two things. First is politicized uncertainty, and the second is institutional ambiguity. Now, everything that Bashir was talking about is a product of institutional ambiguity. It's a product of the fact that institutions are not sure about what purpose they must serve. Must it serve the purpose of the public, or must it serve the purpose of narrow, parochial, provincial, insular interests inside the party? And we know that it's the latter that often unfolds. It's the latter that happens, that the interests that are being served by public institutions are not the interest of the public. They are the interest of private interests, some of them corporate, by the way, in the private sector, who abuse the political process in many ways in order to feed off the predatory and the predation that happens through public institutions. So that's the first problem, institutional ambiguity. The second is politicized uncertainty. So when no party has an absolutely clear majority, and you see what's been happening in the municipalities in Gauteng, in Johannesburg, in Ekurhuleni, and in Pretoria, in Tshwane, those coalitions have been completely unstable. In fact, Johannesburg, I calculated, had a new mayor every 3.5 months. Every 3.5 months, there was a new mayor. Of course, it centered around two people. One person from the DA, another person from the ANC. And eventually, the mayor came from a micro party who was prepared to be used and abused and become an instrument for other political interests. So that politicized uncertainty is what political parties start to use. They politicize because it's uncertain, there's no clear majority, and they use that in order to extract certain gains from the party which they will wish to put into power. Or the larger parties use and abuse the smaller ones to push out a party which may, by means fair or foul, have been elected in government. So the two problems of institutional ambiguity and politicized uncertainty is what the future, unfortunately, might look like in the short term. Is there a way to reverse this? Absolutely. And the way of reversing it is that each individual has to think about and be concerned, and this is where the word fikr comes from, and this is where the word fikr matters, that you have to be, fikr is about contemplation, it's about discernment, it's about thinking correctly, apprehending the reality. And secondly, distinguishing right from wrong. And that should tell you, though, that the parties, the political parties, don't wish to engage in the discernment of what is right and what is wrong, because consistently they appear to be doing everything that's wrong. So the only people who can punish them are voters. Now, there is one view which suggests that people might retreat from voting, and we can see that in the voter turnout. Voter participation levels are going down. People are losing much more interest in politics. They lose interest in politics because they have a crisis of credibility in the political parties. And I can give you some data. Bashir was giving a lot of data, so I think I mustn't be left out. I must give you some data too. Ordinary South Africans have very little trust in political parties. Only 25% of South Africans have some level of trust in the governing party. 25%, less than a quarter. When it comes to opposition parties, it's even lower, at 24%. That means in excess of 75% of people don't trust the parties they actually vote for, which means that the crisis of politics is infecting public institutions and institutions of government, which is why the people in office can behave with the predatory interests and the predatory mentality that they can, because they have not been held to account. In part, they've been held to account by people taking to the streets, by protests, through protests. So I'm not convinced that we are heading for an Arab Spring anytime soon. And we're not heading for an Arab Spring for two reasons. A is that the Arab Spring has been in South Africa, or the African Spring has been in South Africa for longer than we care to know. So from the year 2000, there have been on average 200 protests a year in South Africa. You know, in July 2021, there was this major insurrection in Durban and Gauteng. Of course, you were spared again in the Western Cape. And again here you found that there was the failure of policing and the failure of security and the failure of intelligence. People often quip and say that when you talk about intelligence in government, you're actually talking about a lack of intelligence. So the reality is that that is the political outlook that we're looking at. The coalitions, when people talk about coalitions, are going to breed a greater amount of uncertainty and a greater amount of ambiguity in political institutions. So while the politics may seem okay, while the democracy might seem okay, the government is certainly not okay. And government is not functioning in the way in which it's supposed to. So there's a crisis of responsiveness, there's a crisis of representation. Ordinary people don't feel that their government actually represents them. Like I told you, less than 25% actually have full confidence in the parties that they actually vote for, which is translating into the fact that there's lower voter turnout, that people are reluctant to participate. And there is a view which says ethically it's okay not to participate because you've tried everything. You've tried lawfare, people go to the courts, government behaves with absolute impunity. I mean, it's 30 years later and we're still talking about children drowning in pit latrines. And you know that there are structural court orders which have been issued to government to comply with getting rid of some of the pit latrines. And yet the news can report just this week an additional 3-year-old died drowning in a pit latrine. So even structural court orders are being ignored. And the level of impunity, that's the third point. So institutional ambiguity, politicized uncertainty, and impunity, the third, is the characterizing feature of the way in which politics are unfolding. Now, does all of this mean that we should give up? No. Politics is not everything. And certainly, Muslim solidarity must mean that we still have a stake and should continue to have a stake in the society. Now, how do you do so if government looks so bleak? Over time, inshallah, things might stabilize. But while you wait for things to stabilize, you can't count on it happening in the next 5 or even the next decade, 5 or 10 years. It might take a longer term to stabilize. What happens in the interim? Certainly the activities in terms of aid, in terms of welfare, and so on has to continue. But that is not enough, because those are ameliorative, charitable acts, which are necessary but insufficient. And so levels of self-provisioning, levels of social solidarity have to start going up in the event that you need to provide certain basic services like healthcare, affordable education, and even things like affordable welfare services for low-income earners in terms of the kind of pensions and so on that they might get, because they don't get much of that at the moment. So these kind of acts of social solidarity are going to have to start increasing in the face of the failure of government to provide at the base levels of society. And Sitarba, you sent me an article, I think it's the same article you sent to Bashir, from a big captain of industry, and my response was a little less polite than Bashir. Bashir deleted the message. I was bold enough to say that I think the CEO is talking nonsense. Because while the CEO might be having hope in the fact that you can reverse the problems in electricity, you can reverse the problems in government, you might be able to sustain the debt and pay it off over time if you have a little more austerity, the reality is that CEO is talking nonsense. Because unless and until you reverse the criminal elements and the cartel elements which have begun to take root in government institutions, it is impossible to see any way out of reversing many of these problems. So the unfortunate reality is that though we're going to have politicized uncertainty, though we'll have institutional ambiguity, higher levels of impunity, unfortunately, we will, going along with it, going to have the fact that a greater amount of criminal activity, organized criminal activity, including criminal activity of CEOs, white-collar crime, which is also going to add to the mix. Because the reality is that government corruption doesn't happen on its own. It is aided and abetted, and we've heard a lot of this evidence coming from the Zondo Commission report. The unfortunate reality of the Zondo Commission report is that it looks as if the very people elected into public office have decided that if they are going to be prosecuted, or if there's any oversight over them, that they will take the whole Commission's report on review. And this individual still holds senior public office, is a minister. If you look at the composition of the national executive of the governing party, there are people who have criminal records, crooks, thieves, violent misogynists. There's a whole range of people represented at the upper echelons of the party. So anyone who talks about reform in the political system, at least in the next decade, is probably looking in the wrong place. And so I'll leave you with the final message, that if you want to think of reform, if you want to think about sustainability, you have to look inwards. It's a very unfortunate reality. It's a reality which no one thought we would be talking about 30 years after apartheid, because it means it's an insularity, there's a looking after your own, that the level of solidarity is only amongst people of a similar kind, across the same race, across the same income groups, and so on. The unfortunate reality is that that is what the political system has pushed people to. And with the proliferation of political parties, with the fragmentation of political parties, with a greater amount of people putting themselves up for office only to be abused by the bigger parties, means that the hope will not in the short term lie in politics and political reform, unless there is a major shift in the mindset in society generally. Politics is not, unfortunately, where it's going to be at. And because that's not where because it's not going to be at politics, it means that reforming government in the next decade is actually fairly slim. I know that's not the note you want me to end on, but unfortunately, if we talk about the criteria of what is right and wrong, we have to face the reality of what is looking ahead at us. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum.
Shukran to you, Ibrahim. Brutal, frank, to the point, and giving it the way it is, and that's That's what makes him such an acclaimed political analyst. Our final speaker today, ladies and gentlemen, is affectionately and commonly referred to as the people's judge. His career on the bench has put many bad people behind bars, but on the other extreme, he's also seen to be the judge that has been able to get victories for people who are poor and marginalized. He started with very humble beginnings in Salt River, went to study at the University of Durban Westville in Durban, initially doing part-time selling of shoes, and today has become an acclaimed judge in our country. Goes on to become one of the celebrated people in the judiciary in the post-apartheid South Africa. Retired last year as a judge and nowadays serves as an ombudsman for the legal fraternity in South Africa. To speak on the topic today, ensuring justice for the people, the only insurance for our future, for the next 20 minutes, gives me great pleasure on calling upon Judge Siraj Desai.
Thank you, Sata. You forget one important aspect of my bio, which Ibrahim inadvertently referred to. He referred to the situation where in the new election, individuals can stand for parliament on an individual basis. He also coupled that by saying that can lead to chaos. I incidentally anticipated that, and I gave an order in the last election that the issues be held as they were. Unfortunately, when the matter came up to the Constitutional Court with two good judges dissenting, they reversed my order and allowed now for future elections to take place with individuals participating. I can anticipate chaos, but let me go back to my speech. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum to all of you and to our listeners and viewers. Thank you, Sitar, for inviting me. It's a privilege to speak on this occasion. It's a privilege to share the platform with such a distinguished gentleman. Although I generally differ with accountants. I never liked accountants. I could never count money. So I don't quite agree with you that the poor are not taxed. The poor are taxed horribly with VAT. The VAT applies to rich and poor alike. And the attempts to increase VAT impact not upon the rich but upon the poor. And secondly, the taxation rates, you can talk about it with aplomb, but the decrease of the taxation rate of corporate interests from 40% to 27% and you say 18%, that hardly speaks of a government committed to the welfare of the poor. That speaks of a government or a taxation system predicated upon supporting commercial interests. Now, you also mentioned, I'm only targeting you because you're an accountant, not for any other reason, that the United States of America keeps going. It keeps going because it prints money, firstly. And secondly, Karl Marx predicted 150 years ago that the collapse of the financial system will be predicated upon the collapsing of the banks. The banks in America are collapsing. 2 of them have collapsed now. A bank in Europe has collapsed. So I don't know about America keep on going. And secondly, and finally, China is there. And China and some of the other BRICS countries, Iran in particular, are talking of going off the dollar currency. That will affect America. And for me, for whatever political position I say, inshallah, it will happen, that America will collapse. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that claim. But the important thing, I just had the privilege, I was ill in hospital, so I had time to read books that are less right reading. And I read the book by Stephen Du Toit on the ANC billionaires. I was wanting to know people became billionaires in the short period of time that we were free. But I came to page 110 before I came to any suggestion how people became billionaires. Very little of the book deals with how people suddenly became billionaires. Almost the entire book is predicated upon the thesis that business people brought about change in this country. You and I did nothing. That change in this country was negotiated and finalized by business interests. And they quote extensively my good friend and childhood friend Trevor Manuel, they quote Jay Naidu as people who they consulted with. But they lose sight of the brave struggles that were waged on the streets of this town and in Wankie and elsewhere in Africa to free this country. I think business is trying to create a false narrative there. But what is important is this, and that gives us a moment of hope today. And that is that we are able to gather here, that it's 12 months before an election. There are no Saracens outside, nobody carrying AK-47s in this mosque. Nobody storming this mosque, seems to be their current tradition. So it means it's a period of hope in that whatever is predicted for the future, we can participate in that future by meeting as communities and debating the outcome of the election results. I know that the majority of people in Cape Town, unlike how well you think the city is run, the majority of people vote in this country, in this province, for the most reactionary party, the party that represents the final analysis. It represents only the rich and only white interests. But that's politics. I'm a judge. I'm not supposed to get into politics. But ultimately that is, and also it is the same party, incidentally, which has not uttered a word, not a word in support of the victims of Al-Aqsa. Not a word. So politics is like that, but it does not mean that the situation is hopeless. There are moments when we gather thousands on the streets to advocate a better future. And the fact that we can do so gives us hope. You know, right at the beginning, recently this chap, Mr. Thabo, no, why should I call him Mr. Thabo Bester, escaped from prison. He escaped from a private prison. Now let me tell you the origins of a private prison in this country. I was the national chairman of correctional services when that issue was introduced in 2000. When the issue was introduced, let me just tell you the background, the legal position is this. Before there is any change in the correctional services system, you must send it to the National Council for debate. That issue, the introduction of private prisons, was not sent to the National Council for debate. When I realized it, when I saw the contract, they showed me the contract to be signed with the private prison system, I sent one of our people to raise it with government. And we were given a very simple answer. The PPPs are non-negotiable. The public-private partnerships are non-negotiable. They built 2 private prisons in this country, and after the 2 prisons were built, it was found to be the most expensive prisons in the country to run. And the system was canned after that. But what's more important was that the private prisons abdicate state responsibility to private interests. If they had asked me to debate it then, I would have debated it then. That America has this large system of imprisonment because they have private prisons. The private prisons actually lobby for a great amount of people to be detained in custody so as to increase their profits. So, again, Mr. Accountant, public-private partnerships hardly seem an answer to what we are looking for in this country. It may be so, business-wise, and may cut off a piece and make it work. But where state interests are involved, where national interests are involved, I think a national command is probably more of greater importance, that we could work on something like that. But that is, you're not necessarily wrong, I may be wrong. But what this moment creates for all of us, this moment of elections pending, of debating this country, what is to become in this country, it gives us, we can debate these issues. That's what your session here is very important, Satar, in that we are able to debate the issue as they develop. Besides the private partnerships, you know, the system, when this country became free, it just followed, if you follow the Stephen de Toit principle, it followed the business model and created the current society one finds oneself. We can re-debate that. There's nothing cast in stone. We are the citizens of this country, and we can equally participate in the debates to create a new South Africa. You know, let me not be too pretentious, but you know, the two important events in world history were not Arab Springs, Mr. Isa. Were not Arab Springs. The two important events in world history are the actual world revolutions. The first was the Great French Revolution. And that revolution did not come about simply by people storming the Bastille, as they told you at schools, but it was underpinned by thinking. It was underpinned by philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Diderot. They created the concept, they introduced the ideas of what modern democracy should look like. And then 200 years later was the Great Russian Revolution, probably one of the greatest events of the last century, where the first socialist structure was implemented. But that too didn't come about simply by people standing up and saying, we want this or that type of order. It was underpinned by debate, bitter debates. Lenin and Trotsky differed. Trotsky differed with Stalin to the effect that he got a pickaxe in his back. But the point is this, they differed. There's nothing wrong in standing up and taking up different positions as I'm doing with you today. We should take up different positions, but we should be honest in our debates. We should be honest and say who is right and who is wrong and who is not in the interests of the poor. Ultimately, we must create a society in which poverty is eradicated. Why is this the most unequal society in the world? Why is it that the situation worsened since 1994 to now? Can we blame any particular grouping, or do we blame ourselves for that situation arising? We must do as they did in all preceding events of great moment, debate the issue amongst ourselves, not run away from a debate, face each other in an open and frank manner and debate what the issues are. This is a moment, as I said earlier on, and I agree with the last speaker, that it's not a moment for despair. I take the view, and I do those as a revolutionary. Hope is cardinal to being advocating a revolutionary change, is that we stand up with hope, we stand up without fear, and we debate a future society in which the poor shall triumph. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge Siraj Desai, for being very open and very frank about the question of justice. We are going to end off the session with some questions. I've received some questions here. The one question that has been posed to Ibrahim is, should Muslims be more involved in economics than in politics? There's a mic in front of you.
Absolutely. The answer to that is they must be involved in both. The problem is that the space to be involved in politics is becoming smaller and smaller for two reasons. A, because I think a large number of Muslims believe that they don't necessarily want to be involved and be infected by the kind of antisocial, anti-ethical behavior that often characterizes what passes for politics. And I would argue that we don't actually have a lot of competitive politics. We got a lot of noise, but very little actual competitive politics or real cut and thrust of ideological debate. There's a chimera, there's a pretense that this is going on. So people don't, and I think discerning people don't want to be a part of that. It's a mistake, and I think it can be a mistake. So one should be encouraged to continue participating in politics. Inevitably, you have to participate more in the economy, and Muslims do. But the space to participate in the economy, at least at specific levels, is also starting to shrink. So the space to serve at senior levels of the public service, the space to serve at senior corporate level is not diminishing, but is narrowing. That scope is narrowing. And that scope has to be reopened. Now, there's only one way of reopening that scope, and that is to keep a social compact with all political parties.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the floor? Just want to emphasize that we want questions. You may take a minute to motivate your question, but after that we would like the question. Thank you. That applies to everybody.
Shukran. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yeah, I think we are basically at the crossroads. If I look at the 13 million youth in our country, unemployment standing at 40%, 45%, going to 60%. Poverty at its extremist. Inequality, the gap is getting bigger. The question is, how do we get our youth, how do we give them the confidence to go to the voting poll to say, yes, this is what I want? How do we get the youth to think positively, to think that they can make change in this new world order, which is basically dominated by the neoliberal theory and its policies and its dictates? Where is the hope that we're going to give to them? What do we tell them? Because very soon they're going to point fingers at us and say, look, you guys were at leadership level. You promised again, and you promised again. Question is, how did this country become a failed state? Is it a failed state? Thank you.
So the question is the country a failed state?
No, the first question was, how do we get the youth back to getting confidence in whatever we do?
Emphasis on the youth. Okay. Ibrahim or Bashir? Bashir?
So I think the one on the youth is difficult and pretty much a philosophical question I'd go with. But let me also say, a lot of things happen in the month of Ramadan. And one of the things that happens is that we reconnect with stuff that we missed throughout the year, things like our Qurans and things like the teachings of Islam and all the rest of it. And I think that's where we should start by redirecting our youth to, is to get back to the basics in terms of what we believe and realize as long as that's there, then the hope will always be there. Right, so that's hopefully the first one and probably the best I can give you at this point. On the second question of are we a failed state? I think my answer is categorically no, not yet. Not yet. But we are very fast on our way to becoming there without some fundamental changes in terms of what we do and how we do it. So it goes in line with the previous two speakers that mentioned hope, etc. So we're not failed yet, but there needs to be some fundamental changes. And on a personal level, if someone asked me what would I change, it would literally be, and it's probably an impossible ask, but having some level of integrity in our processes, politics, and I think that's probably the biggest contradiction of the lot, is having integrity in politics. But I think those are the things that will fundamentally make the difference in terms of where we are. Like I said, I believe we can turn it. I believe it is us, the business people, the professionals, the communities that have the capability of turning it, provided that the government provides the platform and creates the enabling environment for us to do that.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I've got 3 very short questions. The first one is, when we speak about corruption and the failed state, we always speak about those in government who are supposed to be the corruptors, but we very seldom make a reference to the corruptees, those in the private sector who actually give over the brown envelope to whoever the public representative is. So that's a question of morality. So the question is, what do we do to restore morality amongst South Africans, civil society? Will they not tangle with a politician who may want to be corrupt? The second question is, should the ANC not be the ruling party? What then is left? You've got the EFF on the far left, one can call it that. You've got the DA on the far right, who looks after, I think to quote Judge, the interests of the rich. The EFF is too radical, so the economy might tank, to the accountant, to Bashir. Isn't the ANC the one that's trying to hold the center in terms of its policies? Then the third question, which is probably a very radical one, but I want to ask in any case. I've always regarded myself as being a Muslim, and that's my faith. It's not a demographic, it's not a race group. So if you ask, should Muslims participate in the economy and in politics, it's like asking, should Christians participate in the economy? Should Jews participate in the economy? I mean, I think as Muslims we must think beyond our faith. Our faith guides us, of course, but not as a separate group within a broader society. And I want all three to please just answer me on that particular question. Thank you.
Okay, so the first question is morality of corruption. Correct? Second one is ANC, should it be the ruling party? Right? And the third one is the question of categorizing Muslims as being part of whatever change we want, instead of just making it a broader South African aspiration. Are those the questions? More or less, okay. Right, who's going to tackle first? Judge.
Yes, thank you. Kashif represents business, so I'll be a bit careful about him. But he's my good friend. Kashif, the question of morality, whether one participates in a corrupt deal, reflects poorly upon the people participating in it. But ultimately it depends upon eradicating poverty. Because people who participate in the massive corrupt deals are people who are poor and just see a chance out of it. But I think we must educate our community to show that our corruption, in the smallest form, results in the problems we're encountering in this country today and may lead to a failed state. I do not say that there is a failed state in this country yet, because all the basic formats of state are still intact. The second question is a more difficult one. I don't want to advocate support for any political party not on this platform. But certainly, any alliance with the right would not be on my horizon. Because we take this country back. We come from a difficult past, and to take us backwards and would not lead us to any solution if it's alliance in the right. The political party you refer to as being on the extreme left, I'm not so sure that they're actually left. I don't think they have read left-wing theory. They mouth left-wing phrases. But I don't think they understand what social reconstruction means about, the creation of a socialist state is all about. I haven't heard He's very articulate, their leader, but he hasn't articulated hopes and aspiration for a socialist society as we read through literature over the last 100, 120 years. So I'm not too sure he's the left. But what is hopefully will happen is that the Centre Alliance would shape the ideology and contain the ideology of the future. But that ultimately depends upon us, those of us who support a political party, to work within its ranks, to organize within its ranks, to agitate within its ranks for a better society and to see that it stays on track. I'm not saying either the parties are off track, but to retain them on track to avoid disasters in the future. You see, what we need to debate today is how we want the future society to look like and see how much we can draw the political parties into that. Whether operate as a Muslim in a corporate world, I accept. But Kashif, I know you operate in the corporate world. But I don't think corporates have a color, nor do corporates have a religion. Their only religion is profit.
I'm going to go back a little bit and focus on this question of young people and getting them more interested in politics. I hate to say that there isn't an easy answer. And I don't have an answer, because if I did, I wouldn't be here. I'd probably be sailing a yacht in the Caribbean, but I'm not. The one thing I would say is that young people must get away from this ideology of wokeism, where you fetishize the idea of identity, whether it be race or gender or religion or any other kind of identity in inverted commas, and push a political agenda very narrowly on that identity. Because that gets away from any kind of redistributive and reconstructive program, or politics for that matter. And that's my only one word of advice. Give up on this narrow ideology of wokeism, because it's unhelpful and it's very narrow, insular and parochial. The second is, Kashif, I appreciate your question about corruption, and I think I was at pains to talk about the fact that captains of industry are often themselves unethical. But I think we also have to be, in the interest of truth, honest about what incentivizes the corporate sector to behave in the way that they do. And if you look carefully at much of what emerged out of the Zondo Commission report, or even if you leave aside that 4,000 pages and just talk about what's in the newspapers, who is it that inflates prices and allows price inflation on tenders or subcontracts or procurement? Who is it that sits on those tender boards and allows these things to be given or makes those decisions? Who, in fact, incepted the policy regime of outsourcing and subcontracting and so on? It's the current governing party. And in having this kind of what the brother called a neoliberal approach, they incentivized this because it served a particular policy goal of BEE, number one. Number two, once that was exhausted, the kind of procurement, subcontracting, outsourcing, PPPs, as the judge called it, is what incentivized people to behave badly, not just in the private sector, but in the public sector too. And that's why people started getting into politics, because they wanted to access public office so that they could start influencing this. The problem is that the past 10 years have taken us into a bind. So even when you say, give government more power, stop the outsourcing, don't let the private sector do what it's going to do, what happened over the last decade? We had more corruption and less development, more underdevelopment, and greater inequality. So even if you give government more power, why would you give government and people more authority when they've already abused your trust? So they've created this weird conundrum where we are stuck. Even those of us who support things like policies of import substitution or improving corporate or increasing corporate tax rates, or reimposing exchange controls. So your friend Trevor Manuel, Judge, should not have allowed the relaxation of exchange controls, but he did. And now you're left with the problem where the trust levels are so low that even those of us who want to support those kind of prescriptive policies don't have a leg to stand on, because the trust has been abused so badly that you don't trust any one of these guys to do what they claim that they will do. And Judge, one last thing. You took a swipe to a party on Palestine. And let me just say this. For all of the governing parties' rhetoric on Palestine, what's the actual policy impact? They allow young Zionists to go and serve in the Israeli Defense Force. They allow trade. They talk about reducing the status of the embassy to a representative office. But what real meaningful impact does that have? It doesn't stop trade. It doesn't stop investment either way. And it certainly doesn't stop young Zionists to go and serve in the Israeli Defense Force. If they wanted to do something, let them take a stance on those three things.
Yes, thank you. I absolutely agree with you on that. And we're working on that as best we can and exercising as much influence as we can to secure a proper result. But this does not mean we must support the party which in real terms supports Zionism.
What I like about today's panel is that they very beautifully agree to disagree and engage with each other. And that I think is a absolutely good lesson for us. Any other questions from the floor? From the lady at the back?
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
I'll just greet my fellow Gautenger there, my comrade Ibrahim Fakir. I want to take us back. I actually just want to make a statement and then ask a question. In 1994, remember we come from where we had Bantustans, and the majority of the fiscus in the economy was allocated to the minority. And when we got our freedom, right, remember that now had to be shared with everybody in this country. And when we took over in this country, our coffers were dry because of sanctions and everything else, right? So how did we share that amount of money that was in the fiscus, which was very little at the time, with everybody in this country? And that's why I say we need to look back at that and check at our, our policy imperatives. Did that perhaps not influence where we're at today? That is the question. We did not deal, we had to dismantle, my personal view, we had to dismantle what we had in place, but we took over everything as is. And all the what did they call it? Comrade Joe Slovo had the sunset clauses stayed where it was, and we just carried on. So is that not the problem, what we're sitting with today? Shukran.
You got the question?
It's much more complicated than that. The reality is that South Africa in 1994 inherited a debt that it had to continue servicing. So that is a major problem, and I would concede that that's a problem which affected or does affect where we are today. However, if you look at the configuration of policy choices which have been made since then, they've been contradictory. I just quipped with Judge Desai that why did we have to relax exchange controls? Was there a reason to do so? Was there a reason that we allowed the demutualization of major financial and other investment houses and allowed them to go list offshore? So you can't blame the inherited problems which are going to shape society, no doubt. But you have to confront the reality of contradictory policy and policies which were well-meaning but badly implemented. I do think that there is a way out. There is a way out. And contrary to what the judge says about a specific right-wing party, the reality in this society is that there are two parties which represent a major constituency of support. It's the ANC and the DA, and you can't run away from that. That's just the empirical fact before you. If you have an ANC-EFF coalition, all of the things that you're talking about that you inherited in 1994 will look like a Sunday school picnic, because the rapacious, predatory approach to public institutions and politics will be exponentially increased to the nth degree. Because let's just be frank, the EFF is a project of megalomania. It's about accessing public authority, public power, and money. It's as basic and as crude as that. There is no real political ideology. It is actually a right-wing movement, not a left-wing movement. So if you want two things in this society, institutional stability and social solidarity across people who are of different income groups and different identities, the only kind of coalition that makes sense to me is the coalition that the judge does not want. And that, I don't think so. In fact, another coalition would be disastrous for South Africa. And the reality is that the ANC, with a returned majority election upon election, has basically abused public trust. So I don't know how you explain to a young or an old person how you're going to reverse this, or how you reverse the impact of 1994 and inherited trends of apartheid. For me, there's only one way of doing so, and that is to extract from those people who were beneficiaries of apartheid, to put their skills and resources to work for the society, rather than to allow it to go offshore.
I say that I disagree most vehemently on the latter point. I think any alliance to the right will be disastrous for South Africa, not simply in economic terms, but in foreign policy terms as well. We've managed to keep the ANC on track insofar as foreign policy is concerned, not simply with regard to Palestine, but also on other issues. The alliance to the right will take us to the right, both in economic terms and in political terms. In political terms, we'll land back in the situation pre-apartheid, which the ANC, if it's not sufficiently strong in the alliance, will be forced to accommodate. I don't think that option is on the table. It's not an option that any right-thinking person would support.
Any more questions, Mohammed?
So, Dalbar, can I just add one thing?
Oh,
Judge,
sorry.
just a question of clarity on that last one. Right? Judge, and I agree with you, it may not be the ideal in terms of what you're looking for, but does the current policies that we have with the ANC support where we're going? Okay, so that's the one, just from a clarity perspective.
Let me just add, that's the whole point why we need to debate the matter. The current policies in place are disastrous. We need to debate them, change them, force them to adopt better and better policies, and also form other alliances. But an alliance to the right wing of this country's political spectrum may win capital and may win money to its side. But we've seen money coming in, capital flowing in with the current policies. It has not gone down to the poor. An alliance of that sort will be not simply a disastrous one in political terms, but it'll be disastrous to the plight of the poor.
Okay, another question?
I was going to ask, given that we imported the kind of constitutional structure that we currently have, the Westminster model that we have, is there not now an opportunity for us to consider an alternate kind of way of governance in the country by having electoral reform that maybe allows the voter public to directly elect people who they trust with their votes? Just a short question.
Ibrahim? Reforming the electoral system.
Oh, you were asking about reforming the electoral system. Well, that was the debate before me, where I had to interpret in narrow confines of the Constitution in the matter where I ruled differently. But the issue there was with what the Constitution allows, and the Constitution allows political parties, only political parties, to participate. Judge Mokheng, the famous anti-Palestinian, he ruled in another judgment that there's something undemocratic of not allowing individuals to stand. The new Constitutional Court, I went with Dikha Moseneke, incidentally, the previous DCJ, and the new court went with the idea to allow everybody to participate would be more democratic. But it just quotes a lot of authority throughout the world where that is happening. But I can see lots of problems, as my colleague pointed out, lots of problems arising. There are lots of problems arising because they haven't been able to formulate a proper parliamentary committee on that yet. But the Westminster system, we saddled with that because our constitution talks about that. Unfortunately, to change the constitution, we need 2/3 of the majority vote. That's very difficult to do. And it may not be desirable in this climate. In this climate, what is important is that we understand what our future as South African holds, what the future is for our children, the education of our children, the welfare of our children, and which political combination provides the best answer. And I think we've come a long way. I don't think the alliance on the right is really seriously spoken about. And what we'll have to do, if it's forced into an alliance with the party ostensibly on the left, you're right, it's not really a left-wing party, one will have to curb their wings to form an alliance. But that's for history to see what happens. But important thing, can I just say one more thing? The important thing is for us to be a voice in this community. I mean, to stand up and speak, our young people to speak their mind. Differ with us if you must. But that we develop a system that our voices are heard. Our voices must be heard.
Mohammed, another question there? I think we'll take 2 more questions and then we'll start.
Assalamu alaikum. I would like to know how well is our Muslim parties doing in Parliament? What is their role and functions at the moment? And how can they help us with the future of politics in South Africa, in Cape Town?
You got that question? Mohammed, can you just repeat it, give us a synopsis of the question?
Our Muslim party is very quiet. In Parliament, we don't hear often or enough from them. What are they doing? Is there a future for our Muslim party? Are they big enough to have a voice? The question is to Ibrahim that knows more about politics. Could you tell us something more about our Muslim parties and what they're doing?
Ibrahim?
Which Muslim party? Al-Jama'ah. Do we have a Muslim party? And I think that's my way of answering that question. We don't, actually. And I know the leader of that party who loves to hate me, and that's fine. But, you know, I don't think you can have in inverted commas, Muslim party. You will find elements in all the different parties which embody certain Muslim values. Historically, of course, it's been the ANC. There's no doubt about that. But Judge, I must again respectfully differ with your characterization of what you consider to be right-wing. I think these days what we have is variations of social democratic parties, actually, at least of what you're calling on the right wing. There may be elements of right wing, but you know, if you look at the city of Cape Town, to be honest, you talk about reconstruction. What is reconstruction? It's about access to health, public transport, basic education, and a minimum level of basic service extension. Now, sure, there are certain areas in which this doesn't happen, but by and large, there is some kind of integrity in government, and there is a drive, as far as I'm aware, in the city to drive towards job creation. And in my book, anyone who incepts a policy of job creation today, irrespective of what their politics might be on other issues, to me is a social democrat who's worthy of supporting. Because if you don't put money in people's pockets, then you really are not serving a public purpose. So that's just a long way of saying, I'm not sure that we have a Muslim party, number one. Number two, that we will find aspects of a Muslim identity reflected in multiple different parties. If you want to emphasize justice, you can. If you want to emphasize redistribution, you can. If you want to emphasize inclusivity and diversity, you'll get that. If you want, and for me, I'm a big supporter of redistribution because that is justice. You will find that, but you won't find it on the extremes. You won't find it on the right, you won't find it on the left, and you certainly wouldn't find it in a Muslim party. Because if you really want to look at the role of the Muslim party, not just in parliament, but at local level where they are better represented, they have shown themselves to be open to use, abuse, and manipulation in service of who knows what. And this is the problem. Our politics in general, Muslim party or not, it seems to be a kind of purposeless politics. People are getting into politics for no other purpose than the purpose of being in office. And that's certainly not what politics is about. So, you know, I don't think we have a Muslim party, and I don't think a Muslim party can in fact survive, because Muslims, by their very nature, would find expression in very many different of the parties. And this is the reality of what South Africa is today. The nature and character of the society from 1994 has changed fundamentally. And none of the political parties have in fact kept pace with the changes in society. And therefore, it's not surprising that there's a crisis of representation. But a narrow, religious, insular party is certainly going to serve no purpose, to be frank.
Question that has been posed to me, and it's for Bashir. The question is that since 1994, when you see the state of a number of like Eskom and the Post Office and PRASA and so on, the question is there an agenda to deliberately bring these parastatals to the point where they are now, so that white capitalists can then buy into it and buy these parastatals at a very, very reduced price?
Talk about the conspiracy theory,
yeah.
Right? So let me answer the question. I think the answer is no. So I don't think anybody deliberately in their right minds could be the architects of something like that over a 30-year period. I think we need to wake up to the reality. Judge, like you said, national assets need to be managed for the benefit of everybody. And the reality about it is that our current government just doesn't have the capacity and unfortunately the competence to look after those assets and manage them the way they should for the benefit of everybody in the country.
Thank you. One more question.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Asif Bubulia. I'm a master's student who is studying towards a master's in education policy studies with a focus on decolonial futures. Firstly, I just wanted to make the comment that, you know, there's been a lot said about how do we get young people involved, how do we inspire confidence in youth. And I feel very fortunate that within our generation, we are seeing young people who are actively reimagining and rethinking the modes of governance and politics and economics that could potentially shape our futures. And I would humbly suggest that perhaps by bringing more young people onto platforms like this, we might begin to engage in those concepts. My question is, I think as bleak as the situation seems, what is also emerging is the prospect for new political philosophies to emerge that could be potentially theoretically deep and conceptually rich. And those may be the subject of debate. But I think that we can agree that that may be where our attention ought to be directed. And my question is, and I'm going to pose this to Judge Desai, how might we capacitate ourselves and our institutions to facilitate the emergence of new political philosophies in which we can ground ourselves and the work in which we can potentially be doing to build more just, more dignified, and more loving futures?
Absolutely. I actually agree with you. There is scope certainly for the articulation of the left position, clearer than it is now. But the only problem is this: in the reality of the current situation, the likelihood one of the political parties winning is clear, or possibly a merger. But your suggestion that a new philosophy be developed, absolutely, we should do that. But you know, the ANC comes from a tradition of Joe Slovo and that sort of left-wing thinking, which Kashif will differ with me, essentially Stalinist thinking that comes down. But certainly left thinking. To say, as my colleague suggested, that we should incorporate another party in that, which is a hopeless situation, because that party is, by birth, by conception, and by its current practices, the most right-wing party in the country.
We'll take the last question there from the gentleman.
Salam wa rahmatullah. As I say in Parliament, shukran for recognizing me. I just want to ask, especially to Judge Desai, as well as to Prof. Ibrahim Fakir, there was a lot of talk about right and left, right and left. And of course, we as Muslims are ummatan wasata, the middle course, not about right and left. So I just wanted to say that we highly agree with Prof. Ibrahim, especially as a university student's perspective, that we have to reject wokeism, which promotes everything that is against the core tenets of Islam, such as radical feminism, LGBTQ. So I just want to inquire, especially seeing that Judge Desai mentioned a lot about the left and socialism, how can we try and advocate against movements that is basically calling against the core tenets of Islam? And of course, socialism at its essence also promotes godlessness, as we know, despite the fact that maybe it is entrenching affirmative action, which could be good to a certain extent, but essentially it is promoting godlessness, a socialist system. So despite the right and left talk, how can we counter all of these movements that we are having today based on the Islamic context rather than the right and left paradigm? Shukran.
Yeah, thank you for that. Talking about the right and left simply is not the concept of left hand and the right hand. The use of the phrase is a short-term way of dealing with the history of the thinking that underpins that. Left thinking underpins itself both to what happened in 1917 in the Soviet Union and what happened before that at the time of the French Revolution. It's a thinking that talks about power being transferred and distributed amongst the poor. Now, I agree. What the current government does may is not entirely Islamic in some of the respects. We may differ as Muslims with them on what is happening, but we don't live in an Islamic state. So we have the choice either of advocating this to become an Islamic state where all Islamic rules are implemented, or we agitate to change the current state to serve the interests of the majority of its people. And serving the majority of its people in this country only means one thing, and one thing alone, and that is genuine redistribution of wealth in this country, including the redistribution of land. Other revolutions elsewhere in the world turned out differently. In this country, we had a negotiated settlement which held up the process of redistribution. But now it's an exciting moment. The fact, I'm old, I'm out of it. But the new generation, emergent generation, is debating these issues. They must debate these issues to create a new order, a new society, and for you to protect the interests not simply of yourselves, but of your future generations as well. And it's your task to do that. I can only assist now from the departure lounge. But it's a bit, but thank you for that. But just appreciate that the question that you asked, we're not living in an Islamic state. We can agitate for those ideas, but accept that the majority ideas will prevail. But there are certain ideas common to all of us. And the idea common to all of us would be a struggle to ensure that the poor triumph in this country, that there are no longer people begging on the streets or getting insufficient pension. You know, one of the greatest strengths of 1994, it's often forgotten. Before 1994, people of color did not get pensions, did not get the same amount of, black people never got any pension. And colored people got a pension of less than what white people got. And since 1994, 1995, there's a pension that's been paid to everybody. That has not changed. And that's been a triumph of the past. Unfortunately, the second triumphant moment was lost when they introduced the RDP houses, because housing is essential to all of us. And the government of the day abandoned RDP for reasons which I'm still not able to fathom. But that would have been an important step in the redistribution of health and wealth in this country. Our health system is under threat now, and we must strive to save it as best we can and urge the government to do that. I mean, we can't simply go to private hospitals. Not all of us have medical aid. So we must try to save the situation the best we can and to create a society in which all of us can live equally and comfortably. Thank you.
One more question? Yeah. That will be the last question for the day.
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
With all this normal talk of the political and economic system of this failing state, how does this state fall in line with the new WEF, World Economic Forum, One World Order, and One World Religion? Where does it fit in? Thank you.
One World Order.
On this one, Ibrahim, I think that the World Economic Forum is an attempt to retain the system in this country. That this country emulates what is happening in the world. That the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Economic Forum are geared also towards a particular objective. And that objective is not in your and my interest.
No, I mean, I don't think that there is this grand agenda of one world government and one world religion and so on. I don't subscribe to that. I do think that South Africa has the sovereign ability to reverse certain decisions, particularly around the things I argued for. That is to reimpose capital controls, that is reimpose exchange controls, reincept the RDP, that's the one thing the judge and I agree on. But the reality is you can't have an RDP if you don't have growth. Anyone who says, no, you can redistribute, I mean, what are you going to redistribute? So we fundamentally agree on the question of redistribution. The question is, what is the modality of that redistribution? And for me, that modality of redistribution will come through only two things. If you have stable institutions and if you have social solidarity. Stable institutions require stable politics, which we agreed we don't have. So what's the alternative? Stable institutions, which are communal, which are community-driven, while you wait for politics to rehabilitate itself. And the last issue was the question of electoral reform. I support electoral reform. Give each person a vote in a constituency, have 400 constituencies in the country, have a 600 member of parliament, 200 people elected off a proportional list, 400 people elected in a constituency, because constituency representatives ensure that there is some kind of development in their areas, whether it's health, clinics that work, schools that work, roads that get done, and so on. And this party system has not served us well.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That brings us to the end of our session today. I just want to call upon our chairperson, Muhammad Abdullah, to make some presentations to our guests. And thereafter, we'll call upon the Imam to make the closing dua. Mohammed? A gift judge from the mosque. Ibrahim, to you as well from the mosque. And Bashir as well. Thank you very much, both Bashir and Ibrahim, flying down to be with us. A special word of thanks to Mr. Hassan Kaji for facilitating that Bashir could be here today. And Hassan actually flew down from Johannesburg just to be here today. We appreciate that very much. And I know that we're living in very difficult times, we're living in challenging times, but on the brighter side of things, the entire world is in turmoil. The entire world is in turmoil. We just need to be what we are, and maybe one of the best examples of doing good in this country is Dr. Imtiaz Suleiman, who is the admiration of so many people. So let's all just commit ourselves in the month of Ramadan, continue to do good to humanity, whether people are Muslim or people are not followers of any faith. Let's just do a little bit of good, and I think that will hold us in good stead, inshallah. With that, I'll call upon Sheikh Abdul Rahman to offer the closing dua. And thank you so much for being with us today here in the mosque and on Radio 786 and on the social platforms as well.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر صدق الله مولانا العظيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.